What's the worst holiday you've ever been on? My boyfriend Gavin and I convinced the lift operator to let us take one last run, even though the resort was closing soon. He said fine, but we had to hurry because he was shutting everything down at 5. The ski lift creaked as it carried us up the mountain, and I remember thinking how empty everything looked with all the other skiers gone. We were halfway up when the lift suddenly jerked to a stop, leaving us swinging 30 feet above the ground. Gavin laughed and said they probably just had to help someone off at the top, but after 5 minutes of sitting there, we started getting nervous. I tried calling down to the operator, but he was too far away to hear us. And when I pulled out my phone, I had no service this high up the mountain. The sun was already starting to set behind the peaks, and the temperature was dropping fast. After 15 minutes, we saw the operator walking away from his booth toward the parking lot, and we both started screaming and waving our arms, but he didn't look up. Gavin said he was probably going to tell someone we were stuck, but then the lights on the lift machinery went dark. 10 minutes later, all the slope lights shut off one by one, and I realized with growing horror that they didn't know we were up here. The lift operator must have thought we'd already come down, and now the resort was closed until Friday, 3 days from now. My hands were already getting numb inside my gloves, and Gavin's face was turning red from the wind. He said we could jump, that 30 feet into snow wouldn't kill us, but when I looked down, I could see rocks jutting out from the thin snow coverage. The safety bar was locked across our laps and wouldn't budge no matter how hard we pulled. An hour passed and the cold was seeping through my jacket, making my whole body shake uncontrollably. Gavin put his arm around me, but I could feel him shivering too. The temperature had to be near zero already and would only get worse overnight. Gavin kept saying someone would notice we were missing, but I told my roommate I was staying at his place for the week, and he told his friends he was going home with me. Nobody would look for us for days. By the second hour, my feet were completely numb, and Gavin was having trouble talking clearly, his words starting to slur from the cold. The wind picked up, making the chair swing sickeningly, and ice was forming on the cables above us. Gavin said we had to try something because we'd freeze to death if we stayed here all night. He started working his ski boot against the safety bar, trying to create enough space to squeeze through, but his hands were too cold to grip properly. Then we heard howling in the woods below, and I saw eyes reflecting in the darkness, circling beneath us. Gavin said they were just coyotes. They wouldn't bother us. But the eyes kept multiplying, and they didn't move like coyotes. They moved like wolves. By hour 3, I couldn't feel anything below my knees, and Gavin's lips were turning blue. He managed to get one leg over the safety bar, but couldn't get leverage to pull the rest of his body through. The wolves were getting bolder, coming out of the tree line, at least 6 of them now, waiting. Gavin said he was going to jump, that he'd rather take his chances with the fall than freeze to death, but I begged him not to leave me alone up here. He said he could go for help, but we both knew he'd never make it past the wolves, and even if he did, his legs would probably be shattered from the fall. The metal of the chair was burning cold even through our clothes, and I could feel my body shutting down, getting sleepy, which I knew was hypothermia setting in. Gavin suddenly said his jacket was caught on something, and when he tried to pull free, I heard fabric ripping. The safety bar had somehow gotten partially unlatched during his struggling, hanging loose but not open enough to escape. He was trapped halfway, one leg over, his jacket snagged on exposed metal, hanging partially out of the chair. That's when the cable above us made a loud groaning sound, and the whole lift dropped about a foot before catching. Gavin screamed and I grabbed onto him, and we could both hear the metal straining under the weight and cold. The wolves below started pacing excitedly like they knew something was about to happen. Gavin's jacket was tearing more with each gust of wind, and he couldn't pull himself back into the chair or push himself out. He looked at me with terror in his eyes and said, "If I fall, don't look down. Just close your eyes." And I was crying, begging him to hold on, but his jacket ripped completely and he slipped further out of the chair. I grabbed his hand, but my frozen fingers could barely grip, and the wolves were gathering directly below us now. And then the cable made that groaning sound again, and I felt the whole lift structure shudder and start to tilt. The cable groaned even louder and the whole chair lurched hard to the right, making Gavin slip another 6 inches through the gap in the safety bar. I wrapped both my frozen arms around his chest and locked them together, using all my body weight to pull backward and anchor him while the wolves below started howling like they knew dinner was coming. My fingers were so numb I couldn't actually feel if I was holding him right, but I forced my hands to stay locked together no matter what. The chair swayed back and forth in the wind, and I heard more fabric tearing from what was left of his jacket. The sound made my stomach drop because that jacket was the only thing keeping his skin from freezing to the metal bar. Gavin tried pushing himself back up using his free leg, but his strength was completely gone after being stuck in the cold for 3 hours. His lips had turned this scary purple color, and when he tried to speak, only a whisper came out saying he was sorry for suggesting we take that last run. I told him to shut up and save his energy. Just focus on breathing while I used my legs to brace hard against the safety bar. The metal was so cold it burned right through my ski pants like touching dry ice, but it gave me the leverage I needed to hold him steady. The wolves were getting way more aggressive now, maybe 8 or 9 of them, pacing back and forth like they could sense something was about to happen. The biggest one jumped straight up toward us, its jaws snapping, and it fell short by only about 10 feet, which made me realize they were testing the distance. If Gavin fell, they'd be on him before he even stopped screaming. I remembered the emergency whistle attached to my jacket zipper and managed to get it to my lips with one hand while keeping the other arm locked around Gavin. The sharp sound cut through the wind and echoed off the mountain, but there was no response from the dark resort buildings below. Nobody was there to hear it. Gavin's body started shaking uncontrollably, which made it even harder to keep my grip on him. I started talking to him about our summer vacation plans, describing the beach house we'd rented and the restaurants we wanted to try. Anything to keep his mind focused while I fought the fog creeping into my own brain. The hypothermia was making it hard to think straight, but I kept talking about warm sand and cold beers and swimming in the ocean. The chair suddenly dropped another few inches with this awful metallic shriek that echoed across the whole mountain. Snow from the cables above showered down on us, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten through my lip without realizing it. The jolt made Gavin slip even further, and now he was hanging mostly outside the chair with just my arms, and the torn remnants of his jacket keeping him from falling. I tried using my ski pole to hook onto his belt, thinking I could create another anchor point, but my hands wouldn't work right anymore. The pole slipped from my grip and clattered down 30 feet to the snow where the wolves scattered for a second before returning to their circle. They were smart enough to know we were in trouble, and patient enough to wait for gravity to do the work. Hour 4 arrived, and I couldn't feel anything below my waist anymore, which meant my legs were basically useless blocks of ice. Gavin's breathing was getting shallow, and I had to shake him every few seconds to make sure he stayed conscious, because if he passed out, his dead weight would pull him right through my arms. The wind picked up again, and the chair started swinging in these big arcs that made my stomach lurch with each swing. Ice was building up on everything now, coating the cables and the chair and making Gavin's exposed skin look waxy and white. I could see frostbite setting in on his ears and nose, but there was nothing I could do about it except hold on and keep him from falling to the wolves. My own body was shutting down, and I knew we didn't have much time left before we both froze solid, or the damaged cable finally gave out. The metal above us kept making these horrible groaning sounds like it was stretched past its limit. Every few minutes there would be a pop or crack that made my heart stop, thinking this was it. This was when everything would snap and send us crashing down. The wolves seemed to sense it too because they'd gotten quiet, just sitting in their semicircle and watching us with those glowing eyes. Gavin mumbled something I couldn't understand, and his head dropped forward against his chest. I screamed his name and shook him as hard as I could with my frozen arms until his eyes opened again, but they weren't focusing on anything. The cold was winning, and we both knew it. The clouds suddenly broke apart and moonlight flooded down on us, lighting up the whole mountain like someone had turned on a giant flashlight. I looked down and my stomach dropped because now I could see the wolves clearly for the first time, and they weren't coyotes at all. These things were huge, maybe twice the size of any dog I'd ever seen, with thick gray fur and yellow eyes that caught the moonlight. There were at least 8 of them now, maybe more in the shadows, and they weren't running around or fighting each other like wild animals usually do. They were sitting perfectly still in a half circle right below us, just watching and waiting like they knew exactly what was going to happen. My brain was getting so foggy from the cold that I needed something to focus on, so I started doing multiplication tables out loud while adjusting my grip on Gavin's chest. 7 times 8 is 56, I said through chattering teeth. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 8 is 72. But the numbers started getting mixed up in my head, and I couldn't remember if 8 times 7 was 56 or 49. I kept repeating them anyway because talking meant I was still awake, and thinking meant my brain hadn't completely shut down yet. Gavin's head suddenly snapped up and his whole body jerked like he'd been shocked with electricity. His arms flailed and he almost slipped completely through the gap in the safety bar before I managed to pull him back against me. He looked around confused like he didn't know where he was for a second, then started mumbling sorry over and over. His jacket was basically destroyed now, just strips of fabric hanging from his shoulders, and I could see his bare arms turning this scary white color in the moonlight. The wind was cutting right through his shirt, and his whole body was shaking, so hard I could barely hold on to him. I made a decision and started unzipping my own jacket with one hand while keeping the other locked around his chest. The second I got it open, the wind hit me like 1,000 needles stabbing into my skin all at once. I pulled the jacket as wide as I could and tried to wrap it around both of us, pressing his back against my chest and pulling the sides around him. It wasn't much, but at least his shaking got a little less violent, and I could feel some of our body heat trapped between us. The wolves had gone completely silent now, which was somehow way worse than when they were howling. They just sat there in their perfect semicircle, not moving, not making any sound, just staring up at us with those yellow eyes. It felt like they knew something we didn't, like they could sense how weak we were getting and were just waiting for the right moment. Movement caught my eye down on the mountain access road, and my heart jumped thinking maybe someone was coming to check on things. I could see a light moving along the road, and I started yelling even though I knew nobody could hear me from this far away. But then the light swept across the parking lot in the same pattern I'd seen earlier, and I realized it was just the automatic security system doing its regular sweep. Nobody was coming to save us. Gavin started mumbling something, and at first I couldn't understand him. But then I heard him say something about his mom's birthday being next week. His words were all slurred and quiet, but he kept saying he promised he'd be there, and he couldn't miss it. I told him we'd definitely make it to his mom's birthday, and started describing the cake we'd get her. Chocolate with vanilla frosting, because that's what she always liked. I talked about the restaurant we'd take her to and the present we'd already bought, anything to keep him talking and breathing and awake. The cable above us made a new sound, different from the groaning we'd been hearing all night. This was more like a twanging sound, like when you pluck a guitar string that's tuned too tight. I could actually feel the vibration running through the metal chair and into my bones. The whole lift structure was shaking slightly now, not swinging like before, but vibrating like it was about to snap. I knew we didn't have much longer before something gave out, and we'd either fall or the whole thing would come crashing down. My phone was in my pocket, and I remembered I hadn't checked it in a while. I used my teeth to pull off my glove, spitting it out onto my lap, and fumbled for the phone with numb fingers. The screen was so bright it hurt my eyes, and I could barely make out the battery icon showing 2%. Still no signal this high up the mountain, but I hit the record button anyway. I held the phone close to my face and recorded a 10-second message for my parents, telling them I loved them and that this wasn't anybody's fault. The phone died right as I finished, and I shoved it back in my pocket, pulling my glove back on with my teeth. I looked toward the east and noticed something that made my heart beat a little faster. The sky over there wasn't completely black anymore, but had this really faint blue color to it, like someone had mixed a tiny bit of light into the darkness. Dawn was coming, which meant the morning crew would be here in maybe an hour or two. If we could just hold on that long, if the cable didn't snap and Gavin didn't slip and we didn't freeze solid, someone would spot us when they came to open the resort. But just as I started to feel that tiny bit of hope, Gavin's whole body went limp against me, and his head dropped forward onto his chest. I shook him hard and slapped his face with my free hand. First soft, then harder, until his eyes opened halfway, and he looked at me like he didn't know who I was or where we were. His pupils were huge and unfocused, and when he tried to talk, nothing came out except this weird mumbling sound that scared me more than anything else that night. I kept shaking him and talking loud right in his ear about how we were almost there. Help was coming. Just stay awake a little longer. Down below us, one of the wolves broke away from the group and started moving different from the others. Not just pacing, but walking with purpose toward the base of the lift tower. It stopped right at the metal support beam and stood up on its back legs, putting its front paws against the tower like it was testing if it could climb, and the other wolves watched with their heads tilted like they were learning from it. The wolf dropped back down and circled the tower twice before trying again, this time getting its claws into some of the lower crossbeams, and I felt my stomach drop because if they figured out how to climb, we were done for. That's when I remembered the emergency flare I'd seen sticking out of Gavin's backpack earlier when he was looking for his phone. The backpack was still on his shoulders, but to reach it, I'd have to let go of him with at least one hand, maybe both, and he was barely staying in the chair as it was. I tried reaching around him with one arm while keeping the other locked around his chest, but I couldn't get the zipper open with my numb fingers. The wolf at the tower base was getting higher now, maybe 6 feet up, using the diagonal support beams like a ladder. Just then, the wind completely stopped like someone had flipped a switch, and in that sudden quiet, I heard something that made my heart jump. It was a mechanical sound, like an engine, coming from somewhere down the mountain. Way too early for the resort to open, but maybe someone was doing maintenance or checking something before the crowds arrived. I grabbed the whistle still hanging from my jacket and blew 3 short blasts. The pattern everyone knows means help, and without the wind, the sound carried far, bouncing off the mountain walls and echoing back at us. The wolves all turned their heads toward the sound, and the one on the tower dropped back to the ground, but they didn't run away, just stood there watching and waiting. Gavin started talking again, but this time it was worse because he was looking past me at something that wasn't there, saying his grandfather was here to take him home. His grandfather had been dead for 2 years, and I knew from my wilderness first aid training that hallucinating dead relatives meant his core temperature was dangerously low, maybe past the point of no return. I shook him harder and yelled right in his face to stay with me, told him his grandfather wasn't here, it was just us, but he kept reaching out toward nothing with this peaceful smile on his face. The chair made a horrible metal screaming sound and dropped at least another foot, tilting so steep now that Gavin started sliding right through the gap where the safety bar was twisted. Only my arms locked under his armpits kept him from falling completely through, and I could feel my grip getting weaker every second. The mechanical sound was definitely getting louder, and I recognized it now as a snowcat, one of those big machines they use to groom the ski runs. I tried to wave, but both my arms were wrapped around Gavin, and if I let go even for a second, he'd fall for sure. My helmet had a small LED light on it for night skiing, and I started clicking it on. And off with my chin against the button. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, over and over. The SOS pattern my dad taught me when I was a kid. The tiny light beam seemed so weak against the huge dark mountain, but it was literally the only thing I could do while holding Gavin. The snowcat engine sound stopped somewhere near the base lodge, and I saw headlights sweep across the lower slopes as it turned. The driver was checking the trails, making sure they were ready for opening day, and his name was Craig Peterson, according to his schedule that I'd seen posted in the lodge yesterday when we checked in. Craig's lights swept back and forth across the runs in a regular pattern, and I kept clicking my helmet light, praying he'd notice the tiny flashing up here on the deadlift. The wolves had spread out again, some watching us, some watching the lights below, all of them still waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Craig's headlights swept across the lower slopes one more time, and that's when they caught something weird. My ski stuck upright in the snow with the pole strap whipping around in the wind like some kind of makeshift flag. He stopped the snowcat and climbed out to check what the hell someone's equipment was doing planted in the middle of the run. And when he looked up toward the dark lift line, he must have seen our tiny helmet light still blinking its SOS pattern, because he grabbed his radio so fast he almost dropped it. The static crackled, and I could hear his voice echoing up the mountain as he called base operations about possible skiers trapped on the North Face lift, and within minutes the whole base lodge lit up like Christmas morning. More snowcats started moving, and I saw flashlight beams bouncing as people ran between buildings. And then the most beautiful sight in the world appeared when Riley Hooper's patrol truck came flying up the access road with its emergency lights spinning. She jumped out with binoculars and found us immediately, waving to let us know help was coming while barking orders into her radio for the emergency lift operator and medical support to get here right now. The lift machinery suddenly groaned to life, and the chair lurched forward about 6 inches before stopping again with a horrible grinding noise that made the whole cable shake. Riley was yelling into her radio that the cable was too damaged to run safely, and they needed the technical rescue team with climbing gear immediately, and I watched more vehicles racing up from town. 2 patrol members started climbing the nearest lift tower while others spread out below us, setting up these huge orange safety nets in case we fell, and the wolves finally backed off into the trees when all the noise and lights invaded their hunting ground. The first patroller reached us after what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 minutes, and he immediately wrapped rescue straps around Gavin, who was barely conscious, his eyes half closed and his skin this awful gray color. The patroller worked to untangle him from the twisted safety bar while talking constantly to keep him awake, telling him he was doing great. They'd have him down in no time. Just hang on a little longer, buddy. They rigged up this rescue basket thing and started lowering Gavin first, while I was still stuck in the chair watching them guide him past the damaged section of cable that looked ready to snap at any moment. Every second dragged on forever as they inched him down, the basket swaying in the wind while 3 patrollers on the ground held guide ropes to keep it steady and away from the lift towers. When they finally got him to the ground, it was my turn. But when the patroller tried to help me stand, my legs just wouldn't work at all, completely frozen and useless like they belonged to someone else. He basically had to lift me into the rescue harness while my joints refused to bend, my knees locked straight and my ankles completely rigid from 4 hours of below-zero cold. The descent felt completely unreal, like I was floating instead of being lowered on ropes, my brain so foggy from hypothermia that I couldn't really process what was happening. Multiple hands grabbed me the second I reached the ground, wrapping me in these special thermal blankets that felt like they were burning my skin even though I knew they were just warm. They loaded me onto a snowmobile and raced toward the warming hut where Veronica Luna was already working on Gavin, checking his vital signs with quick, efficient movements. She stuck a thermometer under his tongue and her face got serious when she read it. 89 degrees core temperature, which she said was dangerously low. Stage 3 hypothermia. Mine was 91, which wasn't much better, but at least we were both responsive when she shined a light in our eyes and asked us basic questions like our names and what day it was. The warming process had to be slow and controlled because heating us up too fast could cause cardiac arrest. So they wrapped us in special heating blankets that gradually raised our temperature, while IV bags pumped warm fluids into our arms. Gavin kept trying to apologize through chattering teeth, but I squeezed his hand to let him know it was okay. We were alive. That's all that mattered right now. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, and they loaded us in while Veronica gave the paramedics detailed instructions about our core temperatures and treatment protocol. Bradley Curry from Resort Operations showed up with a stack of paperwork and started apologizing before we even left, saying the lift operator was already suspended, and they were launching a full investigation into how this happened. The ride to the hospital was a blur of heating pads pressed against our necks and armpits, more IV fluids, and constant vital sign checks while the paramedics kept asking us questions to make sure we stayed conscious. At the emergency room, they continued the gradual rewarming process, while running tests for frostbite damage and other cold-related injuries that might not show up immediately. Over the next week in the hospital, feeling slowly came back to our feet and hands, though some numbness stayed, especially in our toes, which the doctor said might be permanent. Gavin's shoulder was messed up pretty bad from hanging in that twisted position for so long, and needed weeks of physical therapy to get full range of motion back. The resort's insurance covered everything without question, and offered additional compensation for trauma and suffering. Plus, they implemented new end-of-day sweep procedures to make sure no one ever got left on a lift again. They also installed emergency phones in every 5th chair, and upgraded their communication systems so people could call for help from anywhere on the mountain. 3 months after everything happened, I was sitting in our therapist's office watching Gavin trace patterns on the armrest, while we talked about that night on the lift. The cold still made both of us jumpy, and I'd wake up sometimes thinking I was back in that chair, but the nightmares were getting less frequent, and the therapy was helping us work through what we'd survived together. My toes still had this weird numbness that the doctor said might never go away completely, and Gavin's shoulder clicked when he moved it certain ways from hanging in that twisted position for so long. But we were alive, and that's what mattered. The resort had paid for everything without us even having to ask. All the medical bills. And therapy sessions plus extra money for what they called pain and suffering, and Bradley kept calling to check on us and apologize even though we told him it wasn't his fault personally. They'd changed everything about how they closed the mountain now, with 2 people checking every lift and new emergency phones installed in every 5th chair, so nobody could ever get stuck like we did again. Spring came and we decided to take a vacation somewhere warm, as far from mountains and snow as we could get. So we booked a week in Mexico at this little beach resort where the biggest danger was getting too much sun. We were walking on the beach one evening when Gavin stopped suddenly and got down on one knee right there in the sand, pulling out a ring box while I stood there shocked and crying. He said that night on the lift showed him what really mattered and he didn't want to waste any more time. And of course I said yes because we'd already been through the worst thing imaginable together. The wedding planning helped distract us from the trauma and gave us something positive to focus on, picking flowers and cake flavors instead of thinking about wolves and frozen metal. Summer arrived and Gavin suggested we go back to the mountain. Not to ski, but just to see the place in daylight without snow, to face it together and maybe get some closure. I wasn't sure at first, but my therapist said it might help. So we drove up on a sunny July day when the slopes were green and covered with wildflowers instead of snow. The lift had been completely rebuilt with all these new safety features. Bright yellow emergency phones visible in every chair and signs everywhere about the new safety protocols. We stood at the base looking up at where we'd been trapped, holding hands tight while we both remembered that night, and it was weird seeing it in daylight because it looked so different, so much less scary. The spot where the wolves had circled was just a grassy meadow now with a hiking trail running through it, and the lift tower we'd hung from had been reinforced with extra supports. Bradley met us there and showed us all the changes they'd made, the new procedures and emergency systems, and he said again how sorry the resort was about what happened. We told him we understood it was an accident, a terrible combination of mistakes and bad timing, and that we didn't blame anyone personally, even though we'd never ski again. The insurance money had been enough to pay off Gavin's student loans and put a down payment on a small house, so something good had come from the worst night of our lives. We picked a wedding date for the following spring, far from any mountains, at a beach venue where the only ice would be in the drinks. Gavin's shoulder was mostly better after months of physical therapy, though he still couldn't lift his arm all the way above his head, and my feet would go numb if I stood in one place too long. The therapist said we'd probably always have some effects from that night, both physical and mental, but we were learning to live with them and support each other through the bad days. Sometimes I'd catch Gavin staring at nothing, and I'd know he was back on that lift in his mind, and he'd do the same for me when I'd start shaking for no reason. We got a dog that summer, a big golden retriever who loved to sleep between us, and seemed to know when one of us was having a nightmare, nudging us awake with his wet nose. The wedding invitations went out in the fall, simple beach-themed cards with no mention of winter or mountains or anything cold. Our families knew the whole story by then, and everyone was just happy we'd survived, though Gavin's mom still cried every time she thought about how close she'd come to losing her son. We started taking self-defense classes together, not because we expected to fight wolves again, but because it made us feel more in control, less helpless. The instructor didn't know our story, and we didn't tell him, just worked on building our strength back up and learning to trust our bodies again. Winter came around again, and we stayed inside mostly, watching movies and cooking together, avoiding anything that reminded us of that night. The wedding was 4 months away, and we were both excited and nervous, ready to start this new chapter but still dealing with everything we'd been through. Standing at the base of that rebuilt lift in summer, we'd made a promise to each other to focus on the future instead of the past, to build something good from what had happened. We were getting married in May, on a beach where it would be warm and safe, and we were both completely fine with never seeing snow again. Well, there's the conclusion nobody was begging for. If you made it this far, either you're really dedicated or really bored. Either way, you're stuck with me now. Might as well subscribe and make it official.